The Gemara says that the Rebbeinu Shalom showed Moshe Rabbeinu a coin of fire. Matei shel eish heralei HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe mitachas kisei hakavod, and the Rebbeinu Shalom said kizeh yitnu. This is the mitzvah of Machzos HaShekel. That's what the pasuk says. Zeh yitnu. This is what you should give, because the Kadosh Baruch Hu physically showed Moshe Rabbeinu the image of the coin and said, "This is what I am referring to." Now there are several such instances where Kadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu clearly, visually, what was referring to. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu in the Menorah Shel Eish. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu the Levan and how to be Mekadosh it. But those are both intricate concepts. We can understand where you have to show it in order to explain it. Just like by a difficult lesson, sometimes you get up and use the blackboard. So Kaviyachol, the Rebbeinu Shalom explains to Moshe Rabbeinu, shows Moshe Rabbeinu what it's supposed to look like and how you make it. But the mitzvah of Machzos HaShekel is a mitzvah to take a coin and to give it. What do you have to see? What's so hard to understand? If a Rav during the week would give an appeal, so you have to draw a picture of a coin on the blackboard and say, here, this is what I'm referring to, this is what you should give. So many answer the same thing. There's a vart of the Kabrina brought down in the Slonim Eslorim. Moshe Rabbeinu's difficulty with the Matei, what he didn't understand was, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that this coin, money, in parentheses, the money that's the root of all evil, this money was going to be l'chaper al nafshesecha. This would represent the kapara of Klal Yisrael. How can a small coin effect the kapara for Klal Yisrael? For kapara, a person should have to give everything away. There should be mass mesiras nefesh, not just giving a small coin. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu Matei shel eish. Fire represents the fire of the Yetzer Hara that burns within a person. The fire of the Yetzer Hara that prevents a person from giving that coin. And once you're dealing with the Yetzer Hara and a Yid extinguishes that Yetzer Hara, whether it's a small fire or a big fire, then that is l'chaper al nafshesechem. That automatically represents kapara. That's what it means when it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu Matei shel eish. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed the Yetzer Hara that holds back that Matei. Now the kapara of the Yid may depend on his ability to extinguish those fires. The Urge of the Sefer Der Moshe explains this a little differently. The Lashon of the Yerushalmi in Shkolim, Perik Aleph, Halacha Daled, as we quoted it before, was more than just that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu a fiery coin. Rather, Kimin Matei shel eish, Heralei HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe mitachas kisei hakavod, v'amalei kizeh yitna. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu this fiery image of the Medaya from underneath the kisei hakavod, from the heavenly throne. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was showing Moshe Rabbeinu that money can extinguish the light of a person's neshama. If his whole focus on life, his whole perspective is only geared to money. Whatever he does is only based on the dollar signs that he's going to see behind it. Whatever he says is based on money. How he talks to people is based on money. How he plans his day is exclusively based on what is going to be the most profitable for him. That is his whole aspiration in life. As a result, he's extinguishing the other fires, the other cheshek, the other enthusiasm that's supposed to be within the person, the art of his neshama. So money is dangerous. But by the same token, if he conducts himself properly in regard to money, by giving tzedakah, b'leiv shalom, with gemilas chasadim, being mechanech one's children, and so on. So the mitzvah rises all the way up until the kisei hakavod. And he's zeicha to great pleasures, both in this world and in the world to come. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu Matei shel eish. Fire, as we know, is the symbol of either the greatest blessing or greatest curse. Without fire, we can't live, we can't warm ourselves, we can't cook, and fire, if not controlled properly, can obviously destroy. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that's what money is. Money is like fire. Do it right, it is the greatest bracha in the world. You can come all the way up until the kisei hakavod. You can be zeicha to the greatest chusim. Handle it long, and it becomes the symbol of destruction. The Be'er Moshe quotes from the Sefer Dvash Lepi from the Chidah, the Reches Zayin Ois Vav, a most fascinating thing. The Chidah says the world stands for 6,000 years until Mashiach comes. And while in every generation the Yetzer Hara presents many different nisyonos, but for the world at large, there are dominating nisyonos, dominating tests. The first 2,000 years of the world, the Yetzer Hara had its greatest strength to get people to be Pesheya in Znus. You had the Dori Mabel and so on. During the second group of 2,000 years, it was Avodah Zarah. And during the last 2,000 years before Mashiach comes, it's money. It is only during our days that we have this talk of global economies, of how the entire world is sort of linked together. And less people are involved in actually servicing others, and more people are just involved in making money. Not that that's necessarily something evil, but it's something that is a two-edged sword. But that was the Kadosh Baruch Hu's plan for the world. Znus, Avodah Zarah, Mammon. The Rashi Tevis are Zam, anger. There's a pasuk in Chavakuk. The Zam, Titzad Oretz. In other words, this was the plan of the world. Not that each of the respective Nisyanis aren't negated to each generation, but these are the dominating Nisyanis. There used to be a craving for Avodah Zarah, taiva for Avodah Zarah. So the Gemara says in Masechtas Sanhedrin, they took away that taiva. What replaced it? It's brought down in the Or HaChachma from the Mechel of Moshe. Quote, She'achar bitul hu Avodah Zarah shalakad moinen, hamamoin hu Avodah Zarah. Think about it. Avodah Zarah was a psychological state where someone bowed down to some type of a statue or some type of an entity, and he believed that now he doesn't have a daig in the world. His whole desire in life was to donate everything to this power which is going to shield him, which is going to protect him. Don't people sometimes have the same attitude toward money? The Hine Sulam Mutzav Arsa, the ladder stands on the ground. The Baal HaTurim tells us, Sulam, ladder, is Gematria Mammon. Money is the emes of Gashmiistic thing. It is the symbol of Gashmiis. It's what makes the world go round. However, if you handle it right, the money that is based in Artzios, that stands on the ground or in the ground, can reach up to Shemai. And that is if you perform the mitzvahs of chesed and tzedakah that you can, based on the amount of money that is allotted to you. So just like the ladder is a means of either going up or going down, so is money. Now the problem with money is there's very little room for the middle. It's either up or down. And that's why our Pashas Kisisa, begins with Machzis HaShekel, that represents the Kapara for Klal Yisrael. And in this very same Pasha we have the Chet HaEgel that came through money. On the pasuk of Kisisa Esroish, in the Medrash Tanchuma, we find the B'yoyin darshaning the pasuk, Ki Elokim Shaifet, Ze Yashpil Ze Yarim. Ze Yashpil B'masa Egel. That is the ultimate example of how Klal Yisrael virtually goes into a free fall in Ruchnius because of the way they use their gold. And the Ze Yarim, with that same money, the Machzor Shekel, we have our Kapara. So once again, this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu meant, says the Be'er Moshe. When the Rebbeinu Shalom told Moshe Rabbeinu, here is the Metbeya Shaleish that I'm showing you, Mitachas Kisei HaKavai. The Kisei HaKavai, the heavenly throne, represents the shirish of all the Neshamas. The Zohar HaKadosh says, Kol Neshamas Gezuras Mitachas Kisei HaKavai. In other words, the Be'er Moshe explains, Shmira on the inyan of money creates the Tahara for the Neshama that is formed mitachas Kisei HaKavai. And therefore it says also, the Gemara in Bava Basra says that tzedakah is genuza tachas Kisei HaKavai, hidden underneath the Kisei HaKavai. Through tzedakah, in other words, through using money properly, the person is achad to be makabel pnei shechina, because his neshama returns to its makar, to its shayrish, in its complete shleimus, where it came from. There's that famous cliche of the wife who goes off to the hospital to have the baby, and she leaves all the instructions for her husband, details, spelled out clearly, double-spaced, capital letter, how to cook supper, how to change diapers, how to clean the floor and take care of house. And so he speaks to his wife on the phone, and he's complaining that somehow the supper just doesn't seem to be cooking. I don't seem to be getting anywhere with it. And he complains that he followed all of her instructions. He washed the chickens, he peeled the chickens, he cleaned the chickens. The right spices, the exact amount of spices, he put everything into the pot, the water, it's all set to go. And his wife asks him, did you turn on the fire? And the husband thinks for a couple of seconds and says, you didn't write that on your list. There's a very similar marshal brought down in the Ben Pius Yosef, But a person who was an apprentice, a silversmith, and after training him for a while, the silversmith gave him all the instructions, wrote it down for him so he can go off on his own. The only thing he didn't write was that he should place the coals in the fire before he starts working. It gets to a certain point where it's so obvious that if you have to write it, there's a problem. The nimshal is, the Torah gives us instructions for mitzvahs. The Gemara tells us how to perform the mitzvahs. The Shulchan Aruch breaks it down and specifically tells us, after our training period, what to go out and do. But it should be self-understood that a mitzvah has to be done with a cheshik, that a mitzvah has to be done with a brand, that a mitzvah cannot just be a mundane thing to get over with. It is brought down in the Likutei Torah from the Arizal, the Ber Moshe says that a mitzvah below kavana is like a guf without an neshama. And that could also be what HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu, a medbeya shel eish mitachas kisei hakavod. In other words, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu was showing Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Ber Moshe, that when a mitzvah is done with kavana, with islavos, with cheshek, the b'chinas eish, then you are connecting yourself to your shorish mitachas kisei hakavod. Then you are doing what you're supposed to do. In the absence of any real enthusiasm or joy to the mitzvah, it's kiguf b'lo neshama. But the more neshama, the more the mitzvah rises, and that's the zeh yorim that the Medrash refers to. The Chassam Sofer says what's really dangerous is when a person is extremely stingy when it comes to tzedakah, or when it comes to spending money on mitzvahs, or for the chinuch of his children and so on. However, when it comes to a dvar aveira, he opens his pocketbook wide. That's dangerous. That's the order of the kitrut. For tzedakah, you have no money, but for indulging in your aveiras, you do. The Chassam Sofer says that's pshat in the Medrash, v'lekachtem lachem b'yom harishon, rishon lecheshbon avaynis. Why is Sukkot when I'm buying the Daled Minim, rishon lecheshbon avaynis? I just went through my Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, didn't I have a kapara in all my aveiras? Dr. Chassam Sofer Amar de Gevart, when it comes before Sukkot and you have to spend so much money on your Daled Minim, and you have to spend so much money on all of the mitzvahs of the Yom Tovim. So your attitude then has a lot to do with the way you're going to be judged on your previous aveiros. If you're willing to spend money and you do it with love for mitzvahs, even if chas v'shalom a takala occurred and you were nichshol in an aveira, even an aveira that you spent money on, so it's offset by the mitzvah. Every aveira needs a kapara, but the ramifications of the aveira are not so quick to come. It's not so severe because if he spends money on mitzvahs also, you're much closer to doing tshuva on that aveira. But if you are not willing to spend money on mitzvahs, and you have absolutely no problem to spend money when it comes to your own tithes, that magnifies the aveira, that amplifies the aveira, puts it in a whole different scale. So it's precisely after Shoshana and Yom Kippur that you now have kaparas avaynos, and you're starting a brand new slate. There's a whole clean year ahead of you. So it begins by having to spend a lot of money on Sukkot. Because this is the Hakdama to the year. At least if you do this with love, it can offset any possible money you spend on an Aveira. And that's why it's Rishon Hu Lechem Lecheshbon Avaynis, says the Chassam Sofer. This is your first new test of the year to see how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to cheshbon your Aveiros. On what scale are your Aveiros going to be placed? And that explains that Haman comes running with his shkolim to give to Achashverosh. He wants to entice Achashverosh to go against Klal Yisrael, but Haman wants more. Lest the other Lishna Disha Haman, there was no one who knew how to spoke Lashon Hara at the worst possible time in regard to the worst possible things than Haman. Haman wanted to say, look at Klal Yisrael. You don't have to worry about their mitzvahs, they're done without love. You don't have to worry about the good things they do. It's not coordinated. They don't care for each other. Just look how they indulged in your Sudais, Achashverosh. Just look how they enjoyed every second of all this splendor and luxury. They totally forgot the Rabbeinu Shalom. And indeed, the Hana from the Suda of Achashverosh, the total focus, the total immersing themselves in the Gashmias of this world, forgetting that there's a Rabbeinu Shalom, was the source of Haman's Kitruk, and a powerful Kitruk it was. And in addition to that, Haman is going to give all of this money to the royal treasury to help the people. So you see tzedakah is on the side of Haman. Haman had it all planned out. However, the Rabbeinu Shalom said to Haman, your plan is not going to work. The Yidden already gave their machzis shekel well before you have come to Achashverosh with your scholar, and therefore ultimately your kitrug will fail. What shaykhus does one thing have to another? So the Yidden gave machzis shekel in the middle. What does that have to do with Haman's tainas now? And the answer is very clearly the way the Chassam Sofer explained it to us. Haman comes to the taina, look at all this money, look how Klal Yisrael have indulged themselves in the luxuries of your Suda. They completely forgot that they're in Golus, that there's a Rebbeinu Shalom on the world, that they have an oil tire of mitzvahs. They were swept off their feet by all of the grandeur of Achashverosh's Sudas. A terrible kitrug indeed, but Klal Yisrael already made it clear from before, when it comes to a mitzvah of tzedakah, when it comes to an opportunity of gemilas chasadim, sometime that requires great mesiras nefesh, whether it's his personal patience that's being taxed, whether it's time that he's volunteering, whether it's the wallet or the checkbook. Klal Yisrael as a whole personifies chesed, and every door you have those that rise to the top. And this mitzvah of machzis shekel, of the Yidden giving money with love and cheshik for tzedakah, has already offset the kitrug of where nebuch time comes that we unfortunately do the same for our averis. But you have to understand, Haman, that the kitrug of those averis is going to fall short. It has been dulled, it has been muffled by the islavus for the mitzvah of tzedakah that has already preceded it. Thus, even though we understand the basic rule of a right side of the scale and the left side of the scale, and an aveira offsets the schus of the mitzvah, however, as the Bnei Yissakel explains the Shem Ve'arizal, there are three mitzvahs which are not offset, which are not cancelled out by a corresponding aveira. They are tzedakah, gemilas chasadim, and learning Torah b'iyun with yigiyah. Purim represents all three, the Bnei Yissakel explains. Kimu v'kiblu, masha kiblu kfar, they were now makabel the ahava, the Torah, the part that was forced on them by Har Sinai, they now re-accepted with love. That was yigiyah b'Torah. Shloach Monis represents Gemilas Chasadim, and Matanas Liyav Yainim represents Tzedakah. These are the three mitzvahs that are not neutralized by any Aveira. You have to do tshuva on any Aveira, but the point is, the chutzim of these mitzvahs are not lost to Aveiras. And this is our message to Haman. Haman thought he had the perfect formula that is going to dilute the mitzvahs of Klal Yisrael. And our answer to Haman is too late. Our shkolim came before your shkolim. There are certain mitzvahs that simply cannot be taken away from us. And the more we mechazik ourselves in those mitzvahs, then the greater we can look forward to a Purim that represents the end of all the Haman. The Sefer HaKodri gives us a very interesting perspective about the Chet HaEgel. All the Ummahs, all the nations of the world, during that period in the Midbar, and for many, many years afterwards, dealt with religion as something tangible. It had to be something to look at, something to bow down to, something to hold on to, something to serve, something to hug. And even the philosophers of that time that understood that there is some central authority to this world, that there is a creator, also came around to something to hold on to, something physical, in terms of connecting themselves to what they believed. Because we explained that there were different understandings of this. Some held on to some type of a statue, saying that through this statue there is some type of hashpah that comes from some force, some entity that controlled things. They didn't necessarily believe that there was one force that controlled everything, but there was some type of force up there that had a say in what was doing down here, and you can connect yourself to that or win its favor by serving whatever physical realm that particular religion offered. Now the Yidden, when they left Mitzrayim, experienced very tangible realities. There was the Am Ha'anan that surrounded them, that protected them, that brought so much light, that paved the way for them, that washed their clothes. There was the Am Ha'esh that lit up the way at night, that protected them, that took the darkness out of the frightening desert. it seemed that as long as Moshe Rabbeinu was with them, there was always something happening that they could look at, that they could touch and feel. And then, of course, there was Matan Torah that took place in front of their very eyes in living color. Now, of course, it was different, lahavdil than Avodah Zarah. The goyim that served particular kinds of Avodah Zarahs believed that you have to win grace with this particular God in order to get a good paycheck, and you have to get online in front of a different God in order to be healthy, and in front of a different God in order to be athletic, and so on. The Yidden saw clearly by Matan Torah that there was only one, the Rebbeinu Shalom, who created the world, and there was only one, the Rebbeinu Shalom, who sustains the world. But as the Kuzri and others explained this, there was this one vestige of a Avodah kind of thinking that had clung to at least some members of Klal Yisrael, albeit the Erev, but they had some type of hashpah on the others as well. They wanted something to hold on to. They didn't want a religion in theory. They had to see something in front of their eyes. And as a result, when things got confusing, Moshe Rabbeinu had left them. He soared up to Shemayim. He took no food or drink with them. The 40 days, according to their calculations, had passed. Moshe Rabbeinu had not returned. Who knows if he would ever return? The Sultan showed them the meat of Moshe Rabbeinu floating in the air. So there was a certain vacuum over here. And there were those amongst Klal Yisrael, and yes, it started with the Erev, but again, it had some type of limited hashpah on almost everyone. There were those who began to argue, well, if Moshe Rabbeinu is not here to provide us with something we can hold on to and say, this is how the Rebbeinu Shalom relates with us, then we have to come up with our own plan. We have to create some type of an entity. We have to create some type of something real that we can hear, that we can see, that we can touch. Or else we're going to lose our connection to this Rebbeinu Shalom who took us out of Mitzrayim and gave us the Torah. So understand what happened over here, explains the Kuzri. The Yidden weren't denying the existence of the Rebbeinu Shalom, but they thought that they can borrow from the Avodah Zarah a method of how to relate to the Rebbeinu Shalom that somehow became very vague and discreet in their eyes with Moshe Rabbeinu's disappearance. Take note, says the Kuzri. There were very, very few Yidden that actually were involved in the Egel. 3,000 people out of 600,000 is not much of a percentage. What about the fact that there were others who didn't stop them? Well, explains the Kuzri, they had their cheshbonos. They said, if there are those apikarsim amongst us, if there are those that still have alien influences, let it come to fruition. Let it manifest itself. This is when Moshe Rabbeinu comes back, we'll be able to point to them and say, they don't belong amongst us. They're still employing methods of Avodah Zarah. Everyone had their own reasons. Everyone had their own rationalizations. No one really denied the Rebbeinu Shalom. But there was a fatal mistake over here. They disassociated the mitzvahs that they were just taught with their emunah in the Rebbeinu Shalom. Believing in the Rebbeinu Shalom without believing in the mitzvahs of the Torah, or somehow thinking that the two can work independently of each other, was a terrible mistake. The Rebbeinu Shalom had just told them, standing by this very mountain, that it was prohibited to create images, and they made an image. They argued that the mitzvahs aren't enough. We need a statue. It's exactly the opposite. The statue leads you nowhere. Kiyam ha-mitzvahs is what brings emunah into a person's heart. Fulfillment of mitzvahs and the sirus nefesh to abstain from loisases is what gives a person a feeling that he is connected to the Rebbeinu Shalom more so than any symbolism in the world. So they argued, but some of the mitzvahs themselves represent symbolism. What is an Orim if it's not to remind us that there's a luchas inside and there's a Rebbeinu Shalom who gave us the Torah? What is the eating of matzah if it's not to remind us about the chayros? So you see, mitzvahs in general support the idea of something physical in the service of Hashem. So why can't we create our own physical entity? The problem with this, says the Kuzri, is that you can compare it to a marshal of someone who's sitting in a doctor's office and he sees the doctor writing a prescription. and he follows the person into a pharmacy, and the pharmacy fills the prescription, and the person gets better. So he decides, what do I need this doctor for and spend money? I have a better idea. At night he breaks into the pharmacy and starts opening up all the bottles, and he starts drinking everything. The problem is he never made it until the next morning. If there's no direction, if there's no guidance, if you don't know where you're going, then it's a prescription for disaster, not to bring you closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And the Beis Halevi really explains this somewhat from a different perspective. The taina that they had, Ta'ana Kayin, is, if mitzvahs bring us closer to Hashem, and right now we're in somewhat of a void over here because we're not quite sure what's happening with Moshe Rabbeinu, let's create our own mitzvahs. Let's create our own ego and serve it, and we'll come closer to Hashem. I mean, after all, what was the Mishkan itself? What was the Hakrav of the Karbonos? But they made a terrible mistake here. Because it's true. Your mark of a carbon in the Mishkan that brings you closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Your emunah is stronger. Why? Because there's something tangible to see? Because you're not dealing in the abstract? It has nothing to do with it. It's because you fulfilled the commandment to Hashem. When a mother says to a child, please bring me that towel, and the child says, yes, Mommy, right away, there's a certain bonding that forms over here between the mother and child. When you call up your friend and you say, do me a favor, I'm out of town, can you take care of something for me? And your friend does it, that friendship is now stronger. When one person listens to another, when one person says, I don't understand it, but I'll take your advice because I know you're smarter than me, there's a certain connection. There's a certain cementing here of a relationship. When the Rebbeinu Shalom tells us, do something, and we do it, we become closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Why? Because the Rebbeinu Shalom told us to do it. So yes, when the Rebbeinu Shalom told them to make a Mishkan, with all of its intricate details, and Klal Yisrael with Mesiras Nefesh donated and worked and put together the Tzivui of Hashem, they became closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. But when you do it without the Rebbeinu Shalom telling you to do it, you're completely missing the mark. Mitzvah, the Mefarshim explain, means to connect. Tzeves is a plier. It's the way that the Rebbeinu Shalom holds on to us. When a child says, what would my mother want for a present? And you think this way and you think that way and you call this tanta and that tanta. That's an act of love. This child wants to know what the mother wants, and he wants to fulfill it. So when a yid sits down to a Gemara and he says, what is the halacha? When a shor rams into a parah, when an ox attacks a cow, what would the Rebbeinu Shalom want in such a case? That is an act of bonding. There's nothing in the molecules of the Gemara that connect you to the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's the fact that you are seeking what the Rebbeinu Shalom commanded you to do, and you want to fulfill it. And we find an interesting thing. Klal Yisrael witnessing such a marvelous sight. Their enemy, the one who was looking to destroy them, has to schlep Mordechai. He has to lead the horse. Mordechai rides high and proud. The garbage and the sewage comes down on Haman's head. His daughter commits suicide. It would seem that should be the end of the story right here and there. But it's not that way. Mordechai returns to his sackcloth, and Klal Yisrael is not appeased yet. All right, so we know that technically the Gzeira to destroy them had not yet been recalled, so there was no reason for rejoicing yet, but they should have had a good feeling that the political climate was changing in favor of the Jews. Yet when was there the ultimate menucha? Mordechai comes out, Belavush Malchus, and he's wearing the tcheles, and this is the climax of the Megillah. Now Klal Yisrael can breathe their sigh of relief. And again, technically speaking, that's understandable because this comes after the Gzeira was withdrawn and Mordechai replaces Haman in the king's court. But there seem to be some arrows over here in the pasuk that are pointing at something. They're pointing at this wonderful sight of Mordechai sitting high on the horse, yet it's insignificant. In terms of symbolism, Haman schlepping Mordechai around with that big parade should have meant a lot more than Mordechai simply walking out dressed in tcheles. Yet, Mordechai's levush malchus, tcheles l'chur, seemed to be much more reassuring to Klal Yisrael than his riding high on that horse. Yavli Nezris is a ma'ir art. There are several simonim how you can pick out what real tcheles is. The kind that comes from the chalazen fish, the kind that we're supposed to have in our tzitzis. One of the simonim is that this blue dye, real tcheles, can't be erased. You can use the greatest detergents in the world. It is not going to lose any of its color. It's going to stay as crisp and blue as the water, as the sky. It would not fade at all. What happened over here? Klal Yisrael is overwhelmed. Achashverosh makes this big suda for them. And there's a good hashgacha. Kosher meat. Now, Mordechai is standing over there, and he says, don't go. Don't go. Klal Yisrael says, Mordechai, it's not polite. The king invites you to a meal, you go. And if the king takes the time to offer us kosher food, we should for sure go. This great feast was so exciting, it was so fascinating, it captured the imagination of everyone. We're all invited to the king's palace. It's Mordechai, from the old age, out Zusser, nothing you're allowed to do. He views everything as a threat to his religion. If only he would understand. But Mordechai is not persuaded. Day in, day out, he is warning Klal Yisrael, you are making a mistake, don't go. Well, later on, after the chet of Nehenem Yisuda Shalach Achashverosh, Haman rises to power. Klal Yisrael is frightened. Klal Yisrael is threatened with extinction, Rahman al-Islam. And everyone is pandering to Haman except Mordechai. He refuses to bow down. And again, they're saying to Mordechai, what are you doing to us? Stop being frum now. But Mordechai holds his ground. As the Mefarshim explained, he understood that there was a tinge of avodah zarah over here that crept into the hearts of Klal Yisrael as they associated themselves with the Ummos during the great feast, and he had to eradicate that with Mesiras Nefesh. But it wasn't just a one-day Nisayon. This was day in, day out, B'chol yom v'yom. And then Klal Yisrael is jumping for joy. You have this great parade. Mordechai is riding on the horse. And Mordechai returns to his sackcloth. He says to Klal Yisrael, the symbolism of it was encouraging, but the Gzeira is far from over. And he teaches them how to fast, and he teaches them how to cry, and he teaches them what they did wrong, and basically he teaches them where they stepped out of the guidelines of Torah. And finally, as the whole complicated Purim story unwinds, and Mordechai emerges from Achashverosh's palace dressed in tcheles, the Yidden see that Mordechai was right all along. The children of Rachel, Chazal tell us, have this special quality of perseverance, of standing alone against the odds. Does it not say by Yosef, or he, even though Eshes Potiphar spoke to him yom, day in, day out, changing her wardrobe twice a day for an entire year, Yosef withstood every single aspect of that Nisayon, even though it was becoming more and more overwhelming. Well, that's what Mordechai did as well. Mordechai stood alone, while all the other leaders sort of faded into the winds of the time. Everyone's going to the party. Why can't we? Mordechai stood alone and explained, you are overstepping the guidelines of Torah. While everyone else buckled and fell and were frightened of Haman, Mordechai stood alone. Let me teach you what Amunah means. Let me teach you what Mesiras Nefesh means. And the people weren't quite sure they understood it. Not until the Purim story was over, and Mordechai emerged wearing the tcheles. The tcheles that they saw on Mordechai taught them what tcheles is. That as much as sometimes you feel you're in a vacuum, you feel you're alone, you feel, where is the Rabbeinu Shalom? Where is my attachment to the Yiddishkeit that I'm supposed to be serving? Mordechai was not mispoiled. He just continued on following the guidelines of the Torah. Despite despite the overwhelming detergents that were washing away against the spirit of Klal Yisrael, Mordechai's Tchelis remained clear, it remained faithful, and in the final analysis, everyone else faded away and Mordechai emerges. And Klal Yisrael learned the lesson that Mordechai was really teaching them all along, not to be overwhelmed by symbolism, not to be overwhelmed by where things seemed to be going. Mordechai remained loyal not to what was popular, he remained loyal to what was right, to his interpretation of the mitzvahs of Hashem, how the Torah is to be applied given the current situation. And that's why this was the Nechama for Klal Yisrael, because all along, what did Klal Yisrael really want? They wanted to be accepted, they wanted security, so they ran to Achashverosh's party, so they bowed to Haman. It's very similar to the experience Klal Yisrael had when they turned to the Egel, or at least listened to those who argued the point of an Egel. We need security. We need something to hold on to. The Rebbeinu Shem is too abstract to us. Mordechai taught them. Granted, there are nisyonos in life. There are times you feel lost. Open a sefer. Do a chesed. Daven a longer Shemini Esrei, and suddenly you'll see things that you thought were abstract concepts. These very mitzvahs are the most tangible things you can possibly associate yourself with. While everything else fades, this is for real. A famous Bavchan once complained that it's not fair. A Chazan can sing the same nigun again and again and again, and there's no problem with that. But when he has a good joke to say over by a chasana, he can only say it once. The second time, people don't laugh anymore. Maybe that little observation can give us an idea as to how to understand the following Yalkut Shmaini. Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos. The Yalkut Shmaini says as follows: The Yosei Shah at that time, Nigzera Gzeira al Yisrael, a decree was issued on Klal Yisrael, Sheyilmudu Torah mitoch hatzar, that they're going to learn Torah through difficulty, umitoch hashibud, being forced at the same time to work for others, to be subjugated to others, umitoch hatilto, never quite with the menuchas hanefesh that they would like, on the move, umitoch hatiruf, umitoch hatchak, umitoch she'ein lehem nezoynes, not enough parnasa, umitoch oisei tzar. And within all of these difficulties described, all of these frustrations, all of these pressures in the backdrop of where a Yid is supposed to fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah, mitzvahs, the Yidden will still persevere. Through the tzar, they will continue to learn. And as a result of this fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs through tzar, Asir HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'shalom lehem schara l'maysa Mashiach. Eventually, when Mashiach comes, Kadosh Baruch Hu will pay back the reward kafel u'mechupa, double and double. So what the Yalkut Shmaini is saying, yes, after the Luchos breaks, it's going to be much more difficult. The background scenery that you're going to have to live out your Torah during the years that were given to you on this world is probably not going to be an easy scenery to deal with. The distractions are going to be many. You're going to be pulled in many different directions, but if you manage to maintain the tahara of your neshama and still spend your day learning and fulfilling mitzvahs, note that there is some benefit to this. Ultimately, your reward is going to be much greater. The disciple in the Sefer Birchas Peretz explains as follows: Before the Luchos were broken, there was no gzeira that you didn't have to learn Torah mitach tzar. No shibud, no tchak, no pressure. For the Gemara says in the Sechtes Erezin, Ki l'mali le'nishtabru haluchos, had the first Luchos not been broken, le'nishtakha Torah miYisrael, the Yidden would have never forgotten anything. If the Torah would have never been forgotten, that means every Yid somehow would have a natural connection to all of the mitzvahs of the Torah, to every single printed word in any sefer, and therefore our lives would be different kinds of lives. And we wouldn't have to work to understand. There wouldn't be so many children falling through the system of our chinuch. Everyone would have a natural feeling. The Rebbe opens up a Gemara, he starts saying, and suddenly every child has a light bulb that lights up and he understands everything. The Gemara, the Rashi, the Taisus, the Rishonim, the Mefarshim, Al-Pi Kabbalah, everything he understands. That's what would have happened if the first Luchos weren't broken. But the first Luchos were broken. So now, as the Stipler explains it, there's a Metzius Chadasha. There's a whole new reality. And that is, yes, the Torah is within us. It's in our genes, so to speak. The Malach taught us the Torah before we were born, but as we are born and brought into this world, we don't really remember anything. And if we do want to acquire the Torah, it is mitach tzar and it is mitach chak. And it is the perseverance, even with difficulty, that allows us the ability to be able to acquire Torah. The Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah says, "Ein divrei Torah miskaimen b'misha mirapa atzmei aleim." The divrei Torah doesn't really last in someone who has a nonchalant, lackluster attitude to learning. Says the Rambam. And those that have it too good, their Torah doesn't last either. Too much food and drink, that kind of Torah doesn't have the effect that Torah is supposed to have. It doesn't stay. It doesn't have staying power. So who does have the power to hold on to the Torah and it becomes part of him? Ella rather, says the Rambam, one who was Meisanevish himself for Torah, u'mitzayir gufei tamid. It's something that we see b'chush. You open up a newspaper, I'm talking about a kosher newspaper, of course. It's geschmack, you turn the pages, you read, the hours go by, you open up a sefer, and all of a sudden your eyelids stop dropping. And you get very fidgety and you can't sit. There's a famous story. The Polish Shagaita working in the house steals one of the Shafkamars, and when they finally figure out that it's her, they say, why did you do this? And she begins to cry. She says, please, I did it for humanitarian reasons. I have an old father who's been up many nights now. He has insomnia and he can't sleep. So they say to her, so why did you steal the Shafkamar? She says, well, obviously there's some type of magic potion. I see the master of this house, as soon as he takes it out, it works instantly. His head drops. There's no question about it. When a person sits down to learn or starts to learn, there are unnatural maniyas. By design, things happen in the most astonishing ways that either distract us or keep us from learning. It's very, very difficult to break through. Yes, once you break through, then you can do it. But it's as if the Rebbeinu Shalom says, no one is going to be allowed to step into this easily. You have to really show us that you're willing to push and drive. Thus, the Rambam concludes, "Eina Torah miskayemes ela b'misha meimis atzmai v'yahalei chachamim." The Rambam adds these words. You have to be meisanevish yourself to break into the tents of the wise, of the chachamim, of the tzaddikim, and to listen and to stay awake and to work and to chazer over, and despite everything else that goes on in your life, it is not easy. But that's the only Torah that's going to last. Why? Why is that so, asks the Stipler. How come Torah only lasts if it was difficult to acquire? He says there are two reasons. One is a natural reason. That's the nature of a person. When something comes too easy, it just doesn't stay in your head. It flies right out. And even if you do absorb it for the moment, when you hear the next thing, you forget the first thing. But when a person has to work hard to understand, and it's difficult for him, and he pushes himself to understand it, when he breaks through, it's sort of sealed in his memory. He does not forget it. But that's the natural explanation to it. In addition to that, says the Stipler, there is what he refers to as hasiguli, a skula. There's no natural explanation to it, but it's a fact. The tzar, that a person is mitzvah herself over Torah, the yagiyah, the difficulty that he has, does not get lost. There's a tremendous appreciation that a Kadosh Baruch Hu has for someone who pushes himself, someone who drives himself to fulfill mitzvahs with mesiras nefesh. And that yagiyah stands by his side. The Kadosh Baruch Hu says that yagiyah, that difficult work, is going to be his key. If he's going to fight off that sleep, if he's going to fight off the other pressures, if he is going to learn and he can push until he crosses the mark, then he has opened up great doorways for himself. And he'll understand 100 other things. It's the price to pay, and if he paid it, then he deserves it, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says it's going to stay with him. And the Stipler quotes the Gemara Masechtas Sanhedrin, Al Adam Asher Amol B'Makam Zeh, the Terasei Amlulay B'Makam Ach. There's a certain amount of mesiras nefesh that Hashem wants from us when it comes to learning or being mechanech our children. When we get to a certain point, the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, then I'm going to open up doorways for you. And now you're going to understand things that you didn't even work for. because you've worked hard enough. Okay, so what does all this have to do with our opening remarks about that Batcha? Well, I think it's a mashal that really presents very eloquently what Stipler is saying. If you think into it, kosher entertainment can be in one of two ways. Either you make people laugh, and indeed, Rav Nachman of Breslov said that a joke can be a very powerful thing, provided that you maintain three conditions. Condition number one, that your main objective is to make another yid happy, which is a tremendous chus. The Gemara says in the Masechtas Tainis, Rav Broike was standing in the marketplace and he met Eliyahu Hanavi, and he said to Eliyahu Hanavi, look at this rush hour traffic over here, thousands of people walking in different directions, but who is really the one that has a direct ticket to Olam Haba? Are there any real tzaddikim over here? And Eliyahu Hanavi pointed to two people. And Rav Broike went over to them and he said, I'll tell you the truth, you look like ordinary people, but I know that you're special. What do you do? They didn't seem like the biggest Talmidei Chachamim. They didn't look very special. So they said, we're just two friends. And we have a certain minhag. Our minhag is when we see someone depressed, sad, we go over to him and we talk to him and we make jokes and we try to get him to laugh and we do not leave that person until we get him to smile. That's all we do. But Eliyahu Hanavi, out of thousands of people walking in that marketplace, pointed to these two and said they have a direct ticket to Olam Haba. So, condition number one is that your purpose with the joke is really to make someone else happy. You're not trying to create an atmosphere of litzanis. You just want to be mesamech yidden. Condition number two, he says that the joke is 100% clean. When we say 100% clean, it's more than chas v'shalom, something that ought not to be said. But even within the context of things that could be said, it's nikiya. It's fine-combed to an extra level of cleanliness. And the third condition is that it does not contain any lashon hara or rechilas or embarrassing anyone else. You're not making the joke on someone else's cheshbon. So, a joke that meets that criteria, your kavanah to make someone else happy, it's 100% b'tahara, it's pure, no lashon hara, is a kosher form of entertainment. And of course, nagina, music, is for sure a kosher form of entertainment. Right? The Samzer Rav said that chazonim are naranim. Why? Because they stand so close to the Heichal HaTshuva, the Heichal HaNagina so close to the Heichal HaTshuva, and for the most part, so many of them don't bother stepping in. So there are two ways you can entertain people in a kosher fashion, if you do it in a kosher fashion. You can make jokes, or you can sing and play music. And as Adbatson pointed out, how come the music you can hear again and again and again, and people like it, whether they heard it the third time or the fourth time? As a matter of fact, sometimes they like it even more. And a joke is funny only the first time. The second time, it doesn't really do much for you, unless you only got the joke the second time. Perhaps the teretz is that Nagina reaches deep into the neshama of a person. It touches the essence of a person. It creates a certain kayach. It instills within the person a certain sense of simcha that opens up his neshama, that opens him up to emotion and to hergish. We find in Tanakh that the Nevi'im had musical bands before Nevuah when they wanted to generate an atmosphere of Nevuah. Elisha lost in Nevuah for the moment because he got angry. He asked them to play music for him. A joke also makes someone happy, is also entertaining. But what makes the joke funny? What makes it funny is if you're surprised by the outcome. The more obvious the punchline is, the less amusing it is. So in a joke is a kind of waking someone up from a sleep, surprising him into something that was unexpected. And that catches his fancy, catches his attention. The Gemara tells us before Rabbi began his shiur, he always said a Musa de Beduchasa. He always made a joke first. It woke the Talmidim up, it set the stage, it set for a certain mood, and then he would start teaching. A joke in the context of Kiddusha sets a person straight. It wakes him up. It shows him that you can laugh and smile even when you weren't in the mood of laughing and smiling. And once you woke up, then the stage is set for you to pick it up from there, to continue on your own. Nagina doesn't entertain by surprising someone. Nagina entertains by lifting up a person's spirits, by creating a certain environment, by touching on a person's neshama. The luchos rishonos were like negina. A person opened up a sefer, he was like overwhelmed by a symphony orchestra. In the luchos rishonos, you opened up a Gemara, you couldn't close it. How can you close it? The music was so beautiful. The more you heard it, the more you wanted to hear it. And as many times as you learned the Gemara, the more you wanted to learn it. As long as the shiur went, you wanted the shiur to go on. In the context of luchos shniyos, after the luchos were breaking, we don't have these madrigas. We don't have the ability of hearing Torah the way someone hears music. At first, we're sleeping. We have to be woken up. We have to be surprised into the Torah. In a sense of, look, we look around, we see the world, and you're telling me that there's something special about a Gemara? We have all time Adam Haza in front of us, and you're telling me that the true Tainik down here in this world, and one that is the key for the ultimate Tainik, is in a sefer, is going to a shiur? I don't see it, I don't feel it. But when a person tries hard enough, suddenly he breaks through. Suddenly he's happy. But it has to come with Yigiyah. Sooner or later he'll say to himself, I didn't realize how geschmack this could be. But until you get to that surprise, you have to knock very long on the door. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Maisha, the Medrash says, Al titzar b'luchos rishonos. Don't feel bad about the first luchos. Shei aseres hadibros levad. There was just the aseres hadibros. Or b'luchos hashniyim, in the second luchos, ani noitzim l'chashi b'hem halachos, medrash, v'agados. The first luchos was just the aseres hadibros? We wouldn't have had the rest of Shisha Sidra Mishnah, the rest of Shas, the rest of Midrashim? And the answer is no, just the opposite. In the matzav of the first luchos, the Yidden read the first luchos, and automatically they saw Kala Terah Kula, they saw all of Shas, all of the Midrashim, all of Shulchan Aruch, the whole Zohar, everything was there. In the matzav of the first luchos, the Yidden could have read the luchos again and again like a nig, and they would never get tired of it. Everything would open up in front of them. Every yeshiva in the world has one limit: first seder, second seder, third seder, aseres hadibros. And it's like this song. The whole world, all the heavenly spheres, Kol Torah Kula, unraveled in front of them when they listen to this song. Once the luchos are broken, we don't have that anymore. We read the aseres hadibros, we just see the aseres hadibros. We don't see anymore. You want to know Shas, you want to know Mishnayos, you want to know the Midrashim, you want to know Agadat Gemaras, you want to know Zohar, you want to know Sifrei Musar, you have to take it one page at a time. And it's not automatic. You have to go step by step, Madrega by Madrega, from Rebbe to Rebbe, constantly learning something new that you did not know before, a phenomenon that didn't exist with the first luchos. As soon as you saw the aseres hadibros, you knew everything. You just wanted to hear it again and again. That brought you closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the matzav of luchos shniyos, it doesn't work that way. It takes a tremendous amount of yigiyah. Eventually, the Gemara says in Masechtas Sanhedrin, you start learning one thing and you see everything. The Vilna Gaon, in the last 7 years of his life, just learned in the Sefer Torah, and he saw everything in that Sefer Torah. Any Sefer you can possibly imagine in any library, the Vilna Gaon saw in that Sefer Torah. He lifted himself to the Madrega of luchos rishonos. But that was only after many, many sleepless nights. Yes, it was much easier when we had the first luchos, but there was a chasar to it. There would be a limit as to the amount of schar a person is eichel to. I mean, after all, you're overwhelmed by a niggin and you sit there for a lifetime listening to it and enjoying it. Why should you really be rewarded for that? On the other hand, in the struggle for luchos shniyos kind of Torah, where it takes so much energy and the hill is so high, until you finally climb over and you understand and you get it, so to speak. There's a geschmack, and then you have to start on something new. Nothing is automatic. With luchos shniyos, it's harder to break through, but when you break through, you are well deserving of much reward. And this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe. I know it's going to be so much harder now. Then again, bear in mind, umitoch oisei tzar shehi mitztarim, aseh HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'shalom lehem scharam l'maaseh Mashiach. The nature of relationships are that after an argument, and the two partners reconcile. They are much more careful with each other. In a sense, they are closer to each other than they were before the dispute began. It's like weathered wood, so to speak. A relationship that survives a disagreement, or worse, a machlokes, and puts away their differences and comes together, has been tested, and it is now stronger for the effort. And sometimes, partners in a relationship can take advantage after a machlokes to try to attain a certain level of closeness and understanding that they could have never attained, that they could have never reached, had the relationship never been strained. Had it not gone through a ripping of the seams and then a healing process. And that's really what Moshe Rabbeinu's dialogue with Kaviyachol HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Pashas Kisisa represents. Moshe Rabbeinu, after the Chet HaEgel, wants to take advantage, for the benefit of Klal Yisrael, to a post-Machlokes era in the relationship between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu put his life, his very existence on the line to save Klal Yisrael after the Chet HaEgel. And now, there is a period of reconciliation. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, of course Klal Yisrael would have never been destroyed, that was just the Midas Hadin, that had to be the reaction after the Chet HaEgel. So Moshe Rabbeinu wants to take advantage of this and press on it more. So I want you to give me explanations. I want you to reveal yourself more to me. I want to feel more Hashua Tashchina for the sake of Klal Yisrael, to give them the koyach to survive in Galus. Vayoyma Moshe Rabbeinu says, Hareini na es kavaydecha. The Rebbeinu Shalom, show me your glory. Show me. I want to understand. Why are there tzaddikim who have such a difficult time down here in this world? Why are there Rishayim who live such a tranquil life? Show me what Olam Haba is all about. Show me the punishment of Rishayim in Gehenna. And the Rebbeinu Shalom says, what you are asking for, Moshe Rabbeinu, is impossible. No mortal, not even the eyes of the greatest Navi, can perceive the real Hashua Tashchina. That's something for the world to come. However, I will show you my kavod to whatever degree it is possible for you to grasp. Behold, there is a place next to me. Station yourself on the rock. So it sounds like, at least to a certain degree, Moshe Rabbeinu's request was accepted. I mean, the Rebbeinu Shalom said, stand mamish next to me. How can you have a greater revelation of the presence of Shekhinah than that? But Rav Shashua Hirsch explains that no, Adarab. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's response to Moshe Rabbeinu was that your question is wrong, and I will explain to you why what you're asking for you don't need, and what you need you're not even asking for. You want to perceive my presence. You want to see the malachim, you want to see the heavens, which Moshe Rabbeinu did, but he wanted to see more, or he wanted to be mamshechit for Klal Yisrael to be able to see. And understandably so, you want Klal Yisrael to have the emunah, you want them to become close to me. But the Rebbeinu Shalom said to Moshe Rabbeinu, this is a mistake. If you want Klal Yisrael to become close to me, and for us to be able to retain that relationship, then the idea isn't opening up the curtains and to allow for Klal Yisrael to see the heavenly realms. You can see all the heavenly realms in the world, but as long as that Yetzer Hara is still cooking within you, then you will have the same difficulties, the same nisyonos, the same sveikos, the same taivos. How do you become close to me? The Rebbeinu Shalom said to Moshe Rabbeinu, don't stare at me, but stand next to me. Hine mokim iti. There is a place next to me. What does this mean, there is a place next to me? So picture the following mashal. Imagine you have two people. Both of them are in the World Trade Center. And one of them says, wow, I see the whole city, I see the streets, and I see the outline of the other buildings. I see New York Harbor, I see the boats, I see New Jersey. It's amazing what I see. I see the Atlantic Ocean. There's no end to what I see. And the other one says, I don't know. I just see other buildings. And I see some little cars and people on the road. I mean, it's very impressive, but I don't see as much as you see. So the first person says, well, why don't you get onto the elevator and come up to my floor? I'm on the top. You're by the 50th floor. That's very high, but come on up to my vantage point, then you will see what I see. That's what it means there's a place next to me. Come and stand next to me and see what I see. But what does this mean in terms of our relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom? The Rebbeinu Shalom was explaining to Moshe Rabbeinu, I have a certain perspective of Klal Yisrael, a certain appreciation for every member of Klal Yisrael, a certain love for Klal Yisrael, and that's why I gave them Torah and mitzvahs, so we can bond ourselves through this. I can show you, at least to a certain degree, who I am. I can show you the Malachim and Shemayim. We can drop all of the distortions of this world and you can see the Rebbeinu Shalom clearly. But that is not going to make you closer to me. What's going to make you closer to me is to look at the world the way I look at the world. And how would this manifest itself? When a Yid has to make a decision, he's at a crossroad, and he factors everything in, and then he says, okay, what would the Rebbeinu Shalom want me to do? That's what I want to do. And even if you're not sure, but you cry out, the Rebbeinu Shalom, tell me, what would you want me to do? And that's how you make your decision, and that's how you view the world. And that is the greatest level of closeness that a human being will ever achieve. And ultimately, through this, you will be Zoich in Gan Eden to such a Shvar B'Shechina beyond the imagination of any Malach who from his initial creation saw the heavenly realms right away, but he will not be Zoich to what you are Zoich to, because he never had that Nisayon. He never had that Nisayon of standing in a world of confusion and saying, okay, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want me to do? That's what I want to do. I want to learn, to understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu would want me to do. I want to be able to say I am standing next to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and I am viewing this situation. I am looking at this problem and I will go about it in the manner that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would want me to go about it. That's what it means. There is a place next to me. And the more a Yid thinks that way, the closer he becomes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even more so than by Gilui Eliyahu or by heavens opening up to him. The Chassam Sofer was extremely close with his Rebbe, Rav Nosson Adler. And one day, the yeshiva had to disperse for various different reasons. And the Chassam Sofer was aghast. His Rebbe had sent him to France to learn by a certain Rav Shaila in a yeshiva in Paris, or in a suburb of Paris. And he couldn't understand it. Why was his Rebbe sending him so far? When he got there, he encountered many difficulties. Apparently the yeshiva has no dormitory. He had to spend his nights in a kind of a rooming house. And there was this French guy next to him who was going to college, studying law, and he was having a difficulty passing his exam. And he would bang his head manish on the wall, screaming and yelling all night because he couldn't understand his book. But the Chassam Sofer held like the Rambam. The Rambam says, Avi Yishanti, you have to sleep 8 hours. But the Chassam Sofer says, who says you have to sleep every night 8 hours? He slept every second night 8 hours. In the intermediate night, he was up and learning. So when the Chassam Sofer went to sleep, he needed that sleep. And here he had this Frenchman banging on the door, so he had no choice. He knocked on the door and said, why don't you go to sleep? So the man said, because I don't understand this book. So the Chassam Sofer read him the book and explained it to him. And he had to keep on doing this. The man was thrilled. He had the best tutor in the world. It was the only way the Chassam Sofer can get some sleep. And when that person finally announced that he was leaving, and the Chassam Sofer said, Baruch Hashem, now I can properly immerse myself in learning, he got a letter from Rav Nosson Adler to return. And he continued to be baffled because Rav Nosson Adler, even after he returned, never explained to him what the point was. And he wouldn't understand until many years later. Napoleon's army laid siege to Pressburg. They bombarded Pressburg. The Chassam Sofer recorded all the events of that year in a sefer called Sefer HaZachraynis. Miraculously, all those who were under the umbrella of the Chassam Sofer survived. That's a story for itself. We'll leave that for a different time. After the Austrian-Hungarians retreated, they surrendered to the French. Despite the Chassam Sofer's warning that no one should endanger the lives of others, there were two very inconsiderate individuals who decided to take advantage of the situation. And they went around collecting arms from French soldiers who were lying on the field, and they were selling them to the Hungarians. They were arrested. And the Chassam Sofer was also implicated in the charges because they found some records that the Chassam Sofer had once resolved a dispute between these two, although it was unrelated to their arms deals, but that was enough for the French military to assume that the Chassam Sofer was the mastermind behind this rebellion against the French. The Chassidus and these two were going to be tried by a military court, and everyone was told that meant only one thing, a sentence of execution, Rahman. The only thing they had to wait for was for this big military judge to arrive from France, and he would sign the order. The Chassidus wrote his tetzava, then he cried by the cave of Nosnabra. The entire town of Preshburg did whatever they could, but was to no avail. Finally, this big judge, who was known to be an anti-Semit and to be ruthless, arrived. And it turned out, who was this judge? None other than the very one that Chaim Sofer helped pass his initial law exam. Needless to say, the Chaim Sofer was not executed. The Chaim Sofer even prevailed upon him to spare the lives of the two individuals that got everyone into the tzara by engaging in their business. This general even offered the Chaim Sofer to become part of a major Sanhedrin that Napoleon had dreams of setting up, and so on. The Chaim Sofer obviously refused. But then he understood why the Nosnabla had sent him so many years earlier, decades earlier. And the Chaim Sofer typed the pasuk. Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, Hareini nos kvedecha. I know, Rebbeinu Shalom, that after the Chet Ego, we are in for a difficult time. We will accept it. But I beg of you one thing. Hareini nos kvedecha. Explain to us, show us why you are doing this to us. Step by step in the process of Galus, throughout the various different pains and difficulties of Galus, just explain to us why this has to happen and why we have to endure this. And the Rebbeinu Shalom's answer to Moshe Rabbeinu was, stay over here, stand next to me, associate yourself with my mitzvahs. As Shamshua Fol Hirsch explained it, see things from my perspective, even though it's difficult for you to understand it. My Shechina will pass by from your vantage point. And the pasuk goes on to conclude, V'ro'isa es achorai. You will see me from the back, but ufanei lo yiro. You will not see my face. What does this mean? You will see me from the back and you will not see my face. Rashi tells us, Heroloi kesher shel tefillin. Moshe Rabbeinu saw the kesher of tefillin, which you see only from the back, not from the front. The Heilige Chaim Sofer teiched, V'ro'isa es achorai. After you go through the experience, a time will come, whether on this world or in the world of truth, that you will understand everything. That you will clearly see that no Yid suffered an ounce of pain needlessly. No one experienced a morsel of frustration unless there was a purpose for it. In retrospect, the time will come you will look back and you will indeed have 20/20 vision. You will see everything and understand everything. Don't worry. But I cannot explain it to you while it is happening. You can only see it afterwards. For if you will understand it while it is happening, then it won't be in the sign. Then that won't be the test of Galus. And you will not satisfy the purpose of your creation. And the reason that you as an individual live the life that you live with your particular nesiyainos and the difficulties of your specific circumstances. You can't see it from before. You can't understand it from before. You could have a munah that there is a reason and believe that one day you will understand it. And by doing this, by being patient to wait for the Ve'isa Zacharai, to seeing it eventually while you have to go through, and until then, you will maintain your level of amunah and kiyum of Torah and mitzvahs. Through this, you will ultimately be zaycha to such a yeshua, to such an understanding that you could have never possibly attained had you understood everything from the onset, because then it simply would have not been a nesaya. There was a famous story of a man who came to the Baal Shem Tov, and he said, I'm just passing by, but I don't need anything. Just wanted to meet you. And the Baal Shem Tov told him, well, if you don't need anything, let me tell you a story. And the Baal Shem Tov told him a long story. There were two friends, Ruvain and Shimon, best friends growing up, best friends learning in yeshiva together. But then the scripts prepared for their lives had them parting. One got married in one town, the other got married in a different town. Reuven did well. Shimon struggled to the point where he became a beggar. He came crying to Reuven, help me. Reuven said, of course, Shimon, my great friend. And he took half of all of his assets and he loaned it to him. And then the tables turned. When Reuven went running back for the same help from Shimon, Shimon refused to look at him. I don't know you, I don't want to see you. But how could you do this to me? I gave away half of whatever I own to you. So his response was something along the lines of, you're not going to find any akaras sometimes. I took advantage of your naiveness and that's it. Lamaisa, Shimon worked his way back up, and once again Reuven lost his money and he came crying to Shimon. He said, I'm so embarrassed after the way I treated you. And Shimon, fulfilling the mitzvah of Lysikam and Lysitar, made nothing of it, and once again he gave him half of his assets. A couple of years down the line, the table turned for one last time. Shimon comes running to Reuven, begs him, twice I helped you. And Reuven's response, just as cold as it was the first time. He told him, twice you were naive enough to give me half of yours, and I'm not as foolish as you are. But that's the way it stayed. Reuven went one way, he died a rich man, Shimon died poor. When they came up to the Yom Emes and they saw the real meaning of the word wealth, Reuven was in desperate straits. And once again, Shimon bailed him out to the point where Shimon said, I'm willing to volunteer to come back down to this world again as a poor person. Let Reuven be rich, and let him have an opportunity of repaying me. And can you imagine, said the Baal Shem Tov, just last week, the neshama, meaning the person who was Shimon in the previous Gilgal, knocked at Reuven's door, and Reuven slammed the door so hard that he fell down the steps and died. And as Baal Shem Tov finished the story, the person fainted, because that's what happened to him a week before. A Shnara knocked on his door, a pauper knocked on his door, and he slammed the door so hard that the person fell down the stairs and Rahman al-Islam passed away. Baal Shem Tov gave him somewhat of a tick, and he told him to sell all of his assets and support the pauper's family, but it would only be a partial tikkun. And that's the Isas HaChoyrei. You can only understand afterwards, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says. If you would know from before, it would be easier to endure the difficulties, but it would defeat the whole purpose of the Nisayon. It would no longer be a test. And that's what Chazal say, Heroloi Kesha Shel Tefillin. When Moshe saw Kaviyacho only the back, of course it doesn't mean in a physical sense, but in concept he only saw the back of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He saw the Kesha of the Tefillin. The Kesha of the Tefillin is the shame of Daled. The shame of Shaka. Yaakov Avinu said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world, will also say, die, enough of my sorrows. In other words, Yaakov Avinu said, I understand that whatever I have to go through in the course of my life is with the chesh, but it's the reason I'm here, I'm paving the way for Klal Yisrael, and I won't suffer 1 ounce more than what I have to. When there's no longer a need for it, when it will no longer represent my future world forever after, it'll be die, it'll be enough. After the Chet HaEgel, when Moshe Rabbeinu heard that for the Bnei Shalom, Shechina would no longer remain in Klal Yisrael as it did before, so the Medrash says Moshe Rabbeinu reasoned that the student must follow his Rebbe's example. If when the Bnei Shalom is angry at the Bnei Yisrael, he removes himself from them, therefore I must do the same. So Moshe Rabbeinu took his tent and he pitched it 2,000 amos outside the camp. Now take note of that number, 2,000 amos. The dafka 2,000, but not any further. Why? Because any further would have meant that on Shabbos, a Yid who wanted to talk to Moshe Rabbeinu could have not reached it. It would have been past the Tchum. So take a look at what's happening over here. Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to distance himself from Klal Yisrael, but he makes sure that he's accessible. It's like a parent who says to a child in a store, okay, we're going, we're finished, but the child is not finished. He's still looking at some of the toys. And the parent says once more, perhaps this time a bit more irate, we are going, we're finished, it's late. And the child ignores the parent. Because in the back of his mind, the child knows the parent is not going to leave him in the store. So the game begins. The parent starts walking out of the store and says, Moshe, I'm going, goodbye. And the child may or may not glance with indifference because he knows it's all a charade. His parent is not going to leave him. And then the parent finally walks out of the store and closes the door. Now the child may begin to get worried or fickle. Maybe this is different than all the other times. I mean, my mother actually walked out of the store and she closed the door. So the child may wait a minute or two, and when he sees that his mother did not reappear at the door, now the child may begin to panic and races out of the store. And where's the parent? The parent may be down the block, maybe behind a tree, behind a lamppost, but one thing is for sure. The parent isn't all that far. Far enough to get the child scared, far enough to wait for the child to come running, but close enough to make sure that when that child walks out of the store, the parent will be there to see the child. Now, when the child does see the parent, whether he turns around and goes back into the store or not, that's for a different shiur. But for now, this is the point. The idea of the Shekhinah leaving Klal Yisrael was to see whether Klal Yisrael will run after the Shekhinah. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu takes his tent and he pitches it 2,000 ames outside the camp. 2,000 ames. Quite a distance. An am is about 2 feet. But only 2,000 ames, not anymore. The extent of the distance, the perimeter would have to be where if a Yid really wants to, he could come running. Even on Shabbos when there is a problem, when there was a limit of the Tchum Shabbos. We find, but that was the whole idea of going away. To see just when and how the child is going to come running. We find a machlokes in the Gemara, Masechtas Brachos, Av Chav Ches, between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. The shaila was what the entrance qualifications should be for Talmidim into the Beis HaMedrash. Rabban Gamliel was of the more strict view that any Talmud who was not Tzachik about it, if his inside isn't as sincere as what he makes himself out to be on the outside, he ought not to be allowed into the Beis HaMedrash. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's shita was open the door wide and just let anyone who wants to come in to learn. When Rabbi Gamliel was removed from the Nesius because of the story that took place over there, which we won't go into now, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took over, and indeed he opened the Beis HaMedrash wide. And when Rabbi Gamliel saw how many new chairs there are in the Beis HaMedrash, when he saw how the Beis HaMedrash filled up with the open door policy, Chol Shadaka, he felt bad. So the Mefarshim say, why did he feel bad? I mean, what did he think? Obviously, if you remove all the restrictions, the Beis HaMedrash is going to fill up. What surprised Rabbi Gamliel over here? So the Chassidish Sfarim say, Rabbi Gamliel saw that when many of these Talmidim that were not Toichei Kibarim, that indeed were not sincere, came into the Beis HaMedrash, and suddenly they were surrounded by an environment of Kedusha, they became Toichei Kibarim. So initially he didn't want that. He said it's going to bring down the Madrega, it's not going to create the atmosphere that he wants. But when he saw what was happening, that after the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah opened the doors and these Talmidim that still had a lot to learn came in and began to become more sincere, so he felt bad. Now Moshe Rabbeinu explains the Ber Shmuel was a Talmud of the Ksav Sofer. Apparently had the Shita of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah because he accepted the Erev Rav. Even though there was an issue whether they were Teichem Kibarim. Yes, they wanted to come along with Klal Yisrael, but were they sincere? They wanted to come along when the going was good. But would they remain loyal when things got difficult? Unfortunately, we found out the hard way that they didn't. The whole Maaseh Egel was triggered by the Erev Rav. They were the first to complain. They were the first to scream. After the Rebbeinu Shem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Kishiches Amcha, Amcha, your people, you're the one that accepted them. It was not my recommendation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu. So at this point, having seen what a churban took place, because Moshe Rabbeinu accepted the Erev Rav, his shita changed about who to accept. He said, maybe a Talmud has to prove himself. But how do you know whether the Talmud is Toichei Kibari or not? How do you know whether he's sincere? I mean, you can faher him, you can test him to see how many block Gemara he knows. You can ask him tricky questions to see how smart he is. But how do you measure sincerity? What kind of a test is there? What kind of a thermometer is there that can measure just how sincere the Talmud is? Because even Rabban Gamliel wasn't necessarily looking for mitzuyanim. He wasn't looking for people with a high IQ. He wasn't looking for geniuses. He was looking for people that are toichei kibari. That what you see is what you get. That their inside is just like their outside. They're not trying to fool anyone. So how do you test for that? The Ber Shmuel suggests that the test was just how hard is this Talmud going to try to get in? Is he going to take no for an answer, or is he going to continue to knock on the doors and say, my life is in this Beis HaMedrash, how can you lock me out? When he knocked hard enough, Rabban Gamliel knew that he was Toichei Kibari. When he just took the rejection slip and said, okay, you don't want me, I have other places to go, so Rabban Gamliel said, this isn't my Talmud to start with. It's just convenient for him, or it's the style, let's say he wants to come into the Beis HaMedrash. It doesn't mean all that much to him. So in a sense, the rejection was the test. Let's see just how much it bothers you that you can't come in, and let's see if you're going to knock loud enough. Moshe Rabbeinu accepted the Erev Rav. That was a mistake. And what a churban the Erev Rav started. They started the whole Chet Egel. They took advantage of the moment of panic and directed Klal Yisrael to the Egel. So Moshe Rabbeinu now says, okay, I see that the wide open door policy has pitfalls. How can we correct that? How can we look to see who is worthy to learn Torah or not? And he employed the same eitzah Rabbi Gamliel did. He said, I simply cannot make it so easy. I am going to move my tent 2,000 amas away from the Machna, mamish to the edge of the perimeter of the Tchum Shabbos. It's going to be quite a walk, almost 3/4 of a mile. If somebody wants to ask me a shayla or hear a shir, or sit by the table, Leil Shabbos Kodesh, in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu. But at least now I know that it's not just people who are coming because it's convenient, because it's the in thing to do, but they're people that are coming are sincere and really want to learn. The haraya, they're willing to pay a price for it. And that's the lashon of the pasuk explains the Ber Shmuel. Moshe yikach es ha'oil, and Moshe took the tent. This was the whole idea. It should be far away from the Machna. It shouldn't come easy. No one's going to pop in because they happen to be walking by and they say, no, let's see what's doing. This is going to prove who really wants to learn. So those that truly seek Hashem, they're going to come out to the Yomai that's outside of the Machna. And those who are just interested to hear what's doing for convenience, they're not going to bother. It's going to be too far for them. Chazal say, and people come to hear, the Eibush is Meichel the Averis of Klal Yisrael. And there is a question that is asked, what do you mean V'shosh HaChacham Yoishe the Darish when he sits? Wasn't it the derech to stand when they gave shiurim? So the Neder Shmuel answered that yes, when the Chacham gave a shiur in the Beis HaKnesses, he stood. But when he gave a shiur in his house, then he sat. Dr. Ber Shmuel, that's why Chazal tell us B'shosh HaChacham Yoishe the Darish. These people that come to these kinds of drashos, it is for them that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Meichel their Averis. In the Beis HaMedrash, when the Chacham is standing and he's darshaning, okay, it's a madrega. And for many people coming to the Beis HaKnesses is also a Mesiras Nefesh. But you also have those who came to daven mincha, to schmooze a little bit, and between mincha and Ma'ariv the Chacham is darshaning, so he goes out for a coffee, comes in, he listens a little, he doesn't listen a little. He watches the Chacham, he points out the color of his tie, or what kind of a suit he's wearing. And you may hear a word or two. This isn't what the Medrash means. The one who comes to the Chacham's house and knocks on the door, and the Bnei Bayis, they say, we're sorry, we can't let you in, there's not enough place. But he knocks again and says, please, I beg of you, I want to hear, I need this, I need these words of chizuk. It's the Shosha HaChacham Yoishev V'Doyresh, in his house. Here's where the Eibush is Meichel the Averis of Klal Yisrael. And this is what Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to see. Who is willing to come out? Who is willing to go the extra mile? Actually, it was even a little bit less than a mile. That's the Tchum Shabbos. But the point was, who was willing not to take no for an answer? In the Sefer Tuvcha Yabil, Rav Zilberstein, the son of Rabbi Yoshev, points out how these tzaddikim are raised. He says when he came from the Talmud Torah, he lived in Feria, his mother said to him, you know how many tzaddikim there are in Feria? Did you go to their houses? Did you try to knock on their doors? What can you learn from them? And every day I had to come home and tell my mother, yes, I passed their house and I stood there and I watched them and I learned something from them. I couldn't go into the house unless I can repeat something that I gained by trying to sneak into some Gadol B'Yisrael and learn something from him. Because it's a fascinating thing. There was a tzaddik in Yerushalayim, his name was Ramata L'Slanima. He was the Dayan, later became the Slanima Rebbe in Yerushalayim. Ramata L'Slanima was a great guy. He knew the Rambam by heart. And he had a minig. When he came to Yerushalayim, people used to come to him and there was a line. And when it came your turn, you stood there before the Matlas Lanama holding a Rambam and you read the Rambam You read the Rambam from inside. And he would listen, and he who was listening orally, he was listening about that, he would fix your mistakes if you didn't read it correctly. That was a pretty exciting thing to do. I once heard from a Yid who was by Rav Breuer, Zecher Tzadik Levracha. He used to take care of him when Rav Breuer was old. Rav Breuer was a Saginar, he could not see. So the job of this young man was to learn with him. How did he learn with him? He would read a piece of Gemara, and Rav Breuer would finish the Gemara. He would start a Taisus, and Rav Breuer, who couldn't see, would finish the Taisus. That's how they spent their day. So Matl Islam used to correct the person reading the Rambam. But not everyone got a chance to do this. To get to be the one to read the Rambam before him. So he says, my mother wanted me to do it. So I said, only his close people, only the real tzaddikim, the Yidden. I'm a child. When am I going to have a chance to read the Rambam? Don't push me to do it. It's just not going to come out. It won't happen. But my mother persisted, he writes. And then came Erev Pesach. We were all very tired, and you can imagine how hard my mother was working. And she called me and said, now the night of B'dikas Chometz, run to a Matl Islam's house, no one else is going to be there, and ask him if you can read the Rambam. Now's your chance. Who could be there at a night like this? So I said, but his Gabbai won't be there. His Gabbai is at home being B'dikas Chometz. Well, there was no arguing with my mother, he writes. So I came to his house, a house in Yerushalayim. It had only one room. This room was the waiting room. This room was the dining room. This room was the bedroom. I don't even know if there was a chiyuv mezuzah. It could be it wasn't even big enough for that. And really wondering if this is going to work, I knocked on the door. Matl Islamah was about to be by the Chometz, and he said to me, yes. I mean, what could a little child want from this tzaddik, the night of B'dikas Chometz? So I said to him, can I read the Rambam? So he asked me, what are you learning? And I told him Perek HaKoinus. He said, okay, so read the Rambam from Hilchos Nizkei Mamai. And so the Matl Islam continued his preparations for B'dikas Chometz. He kept on sweeping, and I held the Rambam in trembling hands and read it. And he corrected my mistakes. But you know something? From that time on, I got into the rotation. I was a regular to read the Rambam. This child now grew up to be a regular that people come and ask shilas to, and it's a God of Yisrael. Why? Because his mother instructed him. The more difficult it is to get to a tzaddik and learn from him, and the harder you have to knock, and the higher you have to climb. But never take no for an answer.
This shiur is distributed by Kol Hadas, 11 Stei Chemes Street, Yerushalayim. For donations, please call 02-5383-999. Fax 02-538-0267. Postbox 57035.